Hello everyone, I'm Jen and I am a neurodivergent YouTuber and TikToker. And I make videos about my experience when it comes to autism. Now, remember that autism is a spectrum, so you might not relate to everything I say. So if that's the case, just take whatever really resonates with you and leave the rest aside. If you like the information that I share, it would help me tremendously if you subscribe to my channel. Also leave a thumbs up and click on the notification bell so you won't be missing any of my content. Anyways, grab a snack or a good tea because I love tea and maybe you do too. And let's dive into the video. So today we're going to talk about the difference between a regular burnout and a autistic burnout. I know for a fact that some people are divided on the term autistic burnout because they don't really know what is so different about it and whether there should be a distinction. But I believe there should be, and in this video I'm going to take you through why I think that. I noticed that there are a lot of specific differences that occur during an autistic burnout and what doesn't necessarily happens with a regular one. So let's talk about it, and I'm also going to share my experiences with it because I'm in burnout right now and it's pretty shitty. But hey, at least I can talk about it and share my perspective on here. So what I think is so confusing about the two terms is that autistic burnout and a regular burnout really look kind of the same on the surface. Most of the time you see people having a regular burnout when they experience a high workload, and some people with burnout realize that the job they have been in for years are not the kind of jobs that they still want to be in, as in today. And realizing that too late might lead to a burnout. And it is often related to work stuff and everything that happens in the workplace. What's the difference with an autistic burnout? An autistic burnout is more about the experience of daily sensory overload and the fact that we need to handle social situations, even on days that we are unable to do so because we're exhausted and overstimulated. And masking is also a real thing. Some of us also learned how to mask in the workplace, and this is something that can really wear us out. So without taking away from the experience of people with a regular burnout, because that's definitely exhausting too, an autistic burnout often runs even deeper, I think. Because when you end up in a burnout like that, your whole self and the way you used to function feels like it completely disappears. So right now I'm going to dive into the specific signs that overlap, but also where they are different. Number 1, exhaustion. I've seen a lot of people with burnout talking about exhaustion, like being constantly tired all of the time. And I feel like when you have been giving too much for too long, it will lead to you being absolutely drained. Especially when people ask too much from you, like I said before. And it may feel like you're not being appreciated for the person that you are. While for a regular burnout, it can be the case that you have done too much for too long. But I feel like that is specifically more tied to the tasks at hand. So you might be inherently capable of handling a certain set of rules within the workplace and the expectations of how you need to function. But when that baseline gets crossed, so that baseline of normal, so to speak, that is where things start to get messy. It makes me think about the window of tolerance where every person has a certain amount of energy and things they can tolerate. And when you systematically do things that exceed your window of tolerance, you might end up exhausted. But I am still convinced that a lot of neurotypical people have a higher or more flexible window of tolerance than most autistic people. And that when we talk about that window, autistic people need more things in order to stay regulated. And autistic individuals can become overwhelmed much more quickly by various types of stimuli. I've heard many stories from autistic people who feel they need to mask their true selves in the workplace. And when you feel like you have to hide your autistic traits or essential aspects of who you are for 8 hours a day, and for some even up to 40 hours a week, it becomes nearly impossible to sustain. And it's no wonder that this leads to chronic exhaustion. And I think it's such a shame that so many autistic people still feel the need to mask at work just to fit in and go along with the social dynamics. Because here's the thing. The workplace isn't just a place where companies make money. It's also a social environment. And it's where a lot of people spend most of their time. And I feel like a lot of neurotypical people enjoy being social at work. And don't get me wrong, I like being social too, but I approach it in a different way. When I start a conversation or want to talk to someone, I prefer to go a bit deeper into topics. And the things I want to talk about are often less conventional as well. And I also have a social limit button. And once that button gets pushed, most of the time involuntarily, I just can't be social anymore. I'm not judging anyone here, by the way, because everyone's free to talk about whatever they want, especially when it's about their lives. But it's hard for me personally to join in on the conversations people often have at work, like talking about kids, daily outings, or other things that are just normal for them but aren't really part of my life at all. And if those activities are part of it in my life, I engage in them in a totally different way. I am learning to be more open of this and also share parts of myself though. So I recognize that this might be more of a me thing. But still, I don't really have that skill where I can just blend into a conversation and pretend I know a lot about something when I don't. And sometimes I also think it's hard to ask questions when it doesn't really feel relatable or something like that. And I am sure that people can subconsciously notice that, even if it's unintentional, which leads to me feeling left out. And at the same time, I still want to mask my way through those conversations. Like I used to do that a lot of the time. I have also had experiences where people didn't really get my interests, and that definitely makes the conversation more difficult because just because it's not on purpose from both sides, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, you know? That feeling of not being able to relate to your colleagues. And that feeling of not being able to relate to your colleagues can really add to burnout, and it feeds into masking as well. Because when you feel like you're not part of the group, you end up trying really hard to make it work because you want to belong. At least that's how it felt for me. And I should add, by the way, that I didn't feel this way with every colleague because I've had some really great conversations, including about my special interests. So let's talk about number 2, skill regression. I feel like this point is the one that differs a bit from when it comes to regular burnout versus autistic burnout. I think that a lot of people in burnout can relate to the fact that they literally feel unable to do a lot of things. And it might even become harder to cook or to remember some things because your head is literally full of all the things that led you to burnout in the first place. But when you are in autistic burnout, it goes even a step further, right? And that is when it's called skill regression. Autistic individuals might experience a significant regression in their ability to communicate in a way that is understood by allistic or neurotypical people. So, for example, they may have difficulty maintaining conversations, understanding social cues, or even initiating or responding to social interactions, which is a huge shift from their usual behavior most of the time. The sensory overload that contributes to autistic burnout can also lead to sensory processing difficulties. And that means, for example, a loss of the ability to handle noise, light, textures, or smells that are usually manageable. Motor coordination can also regress, meaning activities requiring fine or gross motor skills, like writing, walking, or picking up objects. Those things can become more difficult, actually. And I feel like when you end up in autistic burnout, it really impacts every part of your life in a pretty intense way. And I'm not saying that a regular burnout only affects your work life, because it can definitely affect multiple aspects of your life or your surroundings. But with autistic burnout, sometimes it can feel like I literally can't speak. I can't think, or I can't even do something as basic as go to the restroom, or even cook a proper meal for myself, or get through the day without a melt or shutdown. So autistic burnout feels really heavy. So, yeah, skill regression is a real thing. Let's talk a bit about masking. When I hit an autistic burnout, I've noticed that I lost the ability to mask to the extent that I used to. And I think this is a good thing in a way, and at the same time, it feels really vulnerable. And it's not great in environments where people don't really understand it. Suddenly, I couldn't tolerate a lot of stimuli or handle when things didn't go as planned. And it's not that things have necessarily gotten worse, but now that I'm in burnout, I can just give in to those feelings more, I think. I don't have to keep up the image or pretend I can handle everything. Just something to add, being able to mask is a privilege. Not every autistic person can do it. So when you're in burnout, you may have less capacity to show up in a way that is socially acceptable to others or even yourself. It honestly felt like I lost a big part of myself because I was so used to being able to control how I came across, what I said, how I said it, and how people perceive me. Not so much to create a completely different image, but more to hide autistic traits, because I'm used to people being weird about it. And now that I can't really do that anymore, it just feels strange. It makes you question what you're still capable of and what is really you and what part is just a mask. And honestly, separating the two is really tough because masking has been a part of me for so long. I guess that the only thing I can do now is try to be kind to myself and show up in a way that just feels right for me, not just in a way that meets other people's expectations. And I can only do that because I've gotten better at tuning into my emotions. Because I have a much stronger sense now of what doesn't feel right. So when I'm in a social situation and I feel like I have to present myself a certain way that is not comfortable for me, I immediately know that's not where I want to be and I pull back. And I feel like that's the only way I can protect myself from falling back into old patterns, from masking for others instead of just being there for myself. But like I said, masking is a privilege and not everyone has the option to step away, especially if you're in situations where you have to deal with certain people and there is no easy way around it. Number 3, dealing with unexpected changes. I think one of the biggest differences between an autistic burnout and a regular burnout is how autistic people struggle more with sudden changes. And personally, I have noticed that in an average 8-hour workday, there are so many unexpected changes. Oh my gosh, that really stressed me out because I'm just not great at dealing with change. I need to know exactly what's expected of me, and if something comes up that I didn't plan for, it can throw me off completely. And let's be real, the workplace is usually a chaotic place. You're dealing with different people, different needs, different schedules. People make last minute requests or planned activities suddenly get cancelled. And it really demands a level of flexibility where you have to switch gears like instantly. And I feel like neurotypical people are just naturally better at that than autistic people. And honestly, I think a lot of neurotypical people don't really get this because they might see you as overly sensitive or think you're just overreacting. But for us, it is a real reaction. We don't choose that. And our brains just process things differently. You know, I wish I was more flexible, but I just can't. or when I need to be flexible for a sustained period of time, I just know for a fact that it will stress me out eventually and completely gets me into burnout. So, on top of masking, you're also expected to just go with the flow like everyone else. And honestly, that's just not realistic for me. So, I do have an example when it comes to this area. So, one day at work, a maintenance guy suddenly showed up, and I was the only one there. No one had told me he was coming, and even my colleagues didn't know he was scheduled that day. So, out of nowhere, I had to switch gears, inform my clients, who are also autistic, by the way, and make sure they were okay with the change. And on top of that, I also had to deal with my own stress about the unexpected situation. And of course, I handled it just fine. That's not the issue. Because when something urgent happens, I know exactly what to do. But just because I can handle it doesn't mean it doesn't affect me. That stress doesn't just disappear, but it starts building up over time, and that's what eventually leads to burnout, amongst other factors, of course. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is that for me personally, it's never just one situation that pushes me over the edge. It was a buildup of small, unexpected things happening over and over and over again. Mostly things I had no control over, but still felt expected to handle. And that's where the inner conflict comes in. I know I deal with things differently, and I know these things are hard for me, but at the same time, I feel like I should be able to deal with them. And that constant pressure, that feeling of being overwhelmed by too many stimuli, is what really wears me down. And that's exactly why working from home, I think, would be a solution for some people. I personally need time at home to ground myself because it's my safe space where I can control the stimuli most of the time, and that's just not something I can easily do while being at a workplace. Number 4, sensory overload. This connects perfectly to what I just talked about. Sensory overload at work is brutal to me, to be honest. There are just so many things I really struggle to tolerate, and I feel like this is a big difference between a regular burnout and an autistic burnout. And of course, neurotypical people also get exhausted from too many stimuli, but for them, I think it's more about overall exhaustion rather than this constant feeling of not being able to handle certain specific stimuli at all, if that makes sense. For me, for example, it was the lights. Our office had these super bright lights, and I just couldn't deal with them, especially when I had an evening shift. And I really wanted a space to wind down because I am super sensitive to the pressure of having to socialize all the time. And I know at the same time that I don't have to be talking to people constantly or be around them all of the time. But there are moments in the day where small talk or interaction is kind of expected. And when I say this, it might sound like I don't want to talk to anyone, but that's not true at all. At the same time, though, I needed a private space just for me, just away from people, somewhere to regulate and process everything that came up in my mind. And honestly, that space should not only be available at the bathroom or outside where there are even more loud noises like cars and all of that stuff. So I feel like a lot of things that autistic people ask are not even hard to realize. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's probably better for everyone to just have a room where they can decompress or to be able to have a choice which light they turn on. And it can also be helpful for everyone, not just for autistic people, to know exactly what is expected of them, because that reduces uncertainty and stress, making it easier to do your work well. And now that I'm talking about this, I'm realizing I should probably make a whole separate video about reasonable adjustments you can ask for at work, but that's for another time. This topic about work accommodations actually remind me of a conversation I had with Haye from Autistic FM. That's a podcast, by the way. Go check it out. It's amazing. And he mentioned how so many accommodations autistic people ask for aren't even that extraordinary. In fact, they probably benefit everyone. And sure, some things might not be possible in every workplace, I know that, but I feel like a lot of them are. And we should totally dive into the concept of job carving as well. Because autistic people tend to have spiky profiles, which means we excel in different areas and other areas are like awful to function in and are more of a challenge for us. But if you put us in the right role and apply a tailored approach, we might actually get more work done than ever before. 5. Overlapping demands. Have you ever felt completely drained, and not just from what you're doing, but from the constant pressure of expectations piling up? Well, that feeling, that overwhelming exhaustion, is a big part of what leads to autistic burnout. For many autistic people, especially those with a PDA profile, this stress is even more intense. PDA officially stands for persistent demand avoidance, but I prefer to call it persistent drive for autonomy. Because PDA isn't just about avoiding demands, but it's about having a deep need to stay in control of your own actions. And that's where the real struggle happens, because life, whether it is work, school, or even simple tasks, it is full of external expectations. And the more demands stack up, the more overwhelming they feel. Even tasks that seem small can start to feel suffocating when they turn into an obligation. And this creates a vicious cycle where resisting demands actually leads to more stress and exhaustion. One of the biggest issues is losing a sense of control, at least for me. And the more someone feels like others are deciding how, when, and what they have to do, the higher the stress levels become. And most jobs require you to do specific tasks at specific times, often with tight deadlines. And that is already challenging, but it's even harder when you're expected to do things that you struggle with or don't align with how your brain works. And that makes me think about something, because I think it's really strange that when we used to go to school, it was possible, and I don't say for all schools, because I know that a lot of autistic people have struggled at school because they didn't get accommodated or cared for in a way that they needed that. But I know for a fact that when I went to school, there were a lot of accommodations you could ask for. For example, more time on tasks, or other specific areas where you could be assisted in. But I think it's so weird that if you can ask for these accommodations at school, why can't you ask for them at your job? Or you could, but it's harder to get them at work. At least that's the feeling that I get. And you really have to make a thing out of it. Whereas in school, they just have rules in place for these situations. For example, when someone is dyslexic or someone needs a quiet room when they are autistic. Why can't it be like that at some workplaces? I don't know. Just made me wonder. So let's go back to PDA. Those demands can be overwhelming for anyone, but for autistic people or those with ADHD as well, it can feel completely paralyzing. So let's talk a bit about why typical work structures don't work for most autistic people. Most jobs follow a rigid structure, like the standard 9 to 5 or even 30 to 40 plus hours a week, just to make a livable income. So for many autistic people, this setup just doesn't work. It's not that they can't do the job, it's just that they work differently. Many autistic people are highly productive in short bursts, like, well, the well-known hyperfocus, and they often get more done in less time. But that also means they burn out faster, and they may be putting in just as much, if not more effort than their colleagues. But the traditional system doesn't account for that. If workplaces were more flexible, autistic people could thrive instead of constantly pushing themselves to complete exhaustion. And just know that this is not laziness, because I think that a lot of people would want to be able to function like a lot of people in society do, but they're simply unable to. I am simply unable to. And that's really hard to say, especially out loud. But I need stuff in order to function well. And I think that's not a shame. But instead of asking an autistic person to adjust themselves all of the time, we could also look at what the other side could do to cut us some slack and help us a little bit navigate that space, which is so normal to them, but what feels like a minefield to us. So instead of forcing autistic people to fit into rigid systems, because that's what they are, we need better, more flexible ways of working and living, ones that actually respect different ways of functioning. And I guess if I want you to remember one thing of this video, I want you to remember that if we want autistic people to thrive instead of burn out all the time, we need to start rethinking the way we structure expectations. Not just at work, but also in education and in everyday life. Because when autistic people are supported in the way they work best, they can achieve incredible things. You have no idea. Thank you for watching once again. I feel like this subject is really, really close to my heart, so I got emotional quite a lot during this video. Because I like to speak with passion about this. I feel like we should make a change, and I feel like we should talk about it, because a lot of things are out of our hands. We do have a certain kind of influence, but there are also things that we could use a little help with, you know? Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.